The spring sun hung high over the Montana town of Dry Creek. Its light, sharp and bright, but without much warmth. Dust swirled in the air as wagons rolled into the square and men gathered near the wooden platform that had been built for trading. It was not cattle or horses they had come for that day, though many pretended otherwise. They called it a hiring fair, a chance for women with no families to find homes, but everyone knew it was closer to an auction. Folks liked to watch, to laugh, to pass judgment with their eyes. Clara stood there barefoot, her plain calico dress faded by time, her hair pinned too tightly at the back of her head. She was only 21, but the years had made her look older, worn by work and by the weight of being told she was too simple, too dull, too plain. The auctioneer's voice cracked across the square like a whip, calling for bids as though she were a mule ready to be hitched. Some men leaned on the fence rail, grinning with tobacco-stained teeth. One muttered that she was as flat as the dry fields in August. Another said she would fade into the walls of a house until no one remembered she was there. Clara kept her eyes forward, swallowing each word as if it were dust she could not spit out. Her family had not come with her. They had sold her place with no more care than trading a sack of grain. Better she be someone else's burden, they said, than sit another year at their table. The auctioneer started at $50, his tone full of forced cheer, but no hand rose. He dropped to 40, then 30, and still silence spread through the crowd. A woman in the back whispered that not even the desperate would want a girl with no spark in her. Clara's throat ached, but she stood straight, refusing to cry where they could see. She remembered her mother's voice from long ago, soft in the night, saying that quiet hearts often carried the deepest strength. That voice was gone now, but it lingered enough to keep her standing. When the call dropped to 20, a shuffle of boots broke the silence. A man moved from the edge of the crowd, tall beneath the brim of a worn hat, shoulders broad in his dark coat. His face was lined, not from age so much as from seasons spent against the wind. He did not leer or laugh. He only stepped forward, placed his payment in the auctioneer's hand, and said her name as though it were the only one in the square. Clara felt the world pause, the jeers and whispers cut short, as if the sun itself had dimmed. He did not ask her to step down. He offered his hand, steady and sure. For the first time that day, Clara did not feel like an object to be sold. She felt seen. The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled away from Dry Creek, the sound steady against the silence that had settled between Clara and the man who had claimed her. The sun was dipping lower, painting the horizon with streaks of gold, but the air carried a chill that reached through her thin dress. She sat stiffly on the wooden seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes on the road stretching ahead. The man at her side held the reins with ease, his movements calm, his voice absent. His presence filled the space in a way that was both steady and unreadable, and Clara wondered if she had leapt from one prison only to land in another. She glanced at him, at the rough line of his jaw beneath the brim of his hat, at the dark coat that looked worn but well cared for. His name had been spoken once by a boy in the crowd who whispered with awe, Samuel Hayes. She had heard the name before, carried on gossip around firesides, a rancher who kept to himself, a man marked by loss. They said his wife had died 2 years past, and since then he had spoken little, smiled less, and worked his land like it was the only thing left worth holding. Clara wanted to ask him why he had stepped forward when no one else would. She wanted to know if pity had guided his hand, or if he had seen her as useful in ways the others had not. But the words stayed caught in her throat, tangled in the fear of hearing an answer that would only wound. Instead, she sat quiet, the coat he had offered earlier folded across her lap. It smelled faintly of pine smoke and leather, of a life lived outdoors, of something solid. The trail wound through low hills, past groves of cottonwood, where the leaves whispered in the evening wind. Samuel did not hurry the horses, nor did he speak. The silence pressed heavy, yet it was not cruel. It was as if he carried silence like another tool, setting it down only when needed. Clara thought of the jeers she had heard in the square, the laughter that had stung sharper than a whip. Here beside him, that echo still burned, but his quiet steadiness dulled it just enough to let her breathe. At last, as twilight deepened, Samuel spoke. His voice was low, even, carrying none of the judgment she had come to expect. "You are safe here," he said simply, without turning his head. Clara blinked, the words more startling than any laughter had been. Safe was not a word she had heard often, and hearing it now felt like stepping into a room she had never known existed. She studied his profile, the way his gaze stayed fixed on the horizon, as if the land ahead held all his answers. She did not reply, not yet. She only held the coat tighter, wondering if perhaps this man in the hat was not the end of her story, but the beginning. The wagon rattled to a stop at the edge of a narrow valley where the hills folded in like a cradle. Smoke curled from the chimney of a modest house, its walls built of timber and stone, steady against the fading light. A small corral stretched beside it, a few horses lifting their heads as the wagon approached, their ears flicking in quiet curiosity. Clara sat still on the seat, her fingers curled around the coat in her lap, her stomach knotted with dread and hope all at once. Samuel Hayes guided the horses with the same calm that had carried them out of town, his jaw set, his eyes unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. When he brought the team to a halt, Clara hesitated, her boots still on the wagon's wooden floor. He stepped down first, moving with slow purpose, then turned to offer his hand. For a moment she wanted to refuse, to show she could climb down without help, but the steadiness of his gesture pulled at something inside her. She placed her hand in his and felt the strength there, not a grip to hold her down, but one that steadied her. The ground was firm beneath her feet, yet she felt unbalanced all the same. The house looked plain from the outside, but inside it was orderly, each piece of furniture placed with care. A rifle rested above the hearth, its barrel polished, though not new. The wooden table had 2 chairs, one showing more wear than the other. Shelves lined the wall, filled not only with tools but with books, their spines faded by handling. On the mantel above the fire sat a framed photograph, its edges worn smooth. The image showed a young woman with soft eyes and hair blown by the wind, her smile small but certain. Clara paused, her throat tight. Samuel noticed her gaze, and for a moment his face hardened, as though bracing against something he could not stop. He turned away and set a kettle near the fire, his silence deeper than before. Clara moved carefully about the room, afraid to disturb the air, afraid she was trespassing in a place that did not yet belong to her. She felt the walls closing in, not in cruelty, but in the weight of another woman's memory that still lived there. Every neat surface whispered of someone who had once smoothed it. Every quiet corner carried the ghost of laughter, now gone. Clara's plainness seemed sharper against the backdrop of remembered beauty, and the shame she had carried from town pressed heavier on her chest. Samuel set 2 bowls on the table, stew thick with beans and onions, simple but warm. He gestured for her to sit, his words few, his eyes guarded. She obeyed, though each bite was hard to swallow past the lump in her throat. The silence stretched between them, yet it was not empty. It held grief, it held questions, and it held the faintest trace of something that might one day be more. Clara lowered her gaze, knowing this house of quiet walls was both a shelter and a trial she had not yet begun to understand. The night settled over the valley with a softness that could almost have been kind. Yet inside the little house, the air felt heavy, as though it carried memories too strong to leave. Clara sat by the fire, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes tracing the flames as they licked the blackened logs. She could hear Samuel moving quietly behind her, his boots steady on the wooden floor, his presence filling the space without words. The house was warm. The stew had eased the ache in her stomach, yet she felt no comfort. The photograph on the mantel drew her gaze again and again, the young woman whose smile seemed to glow even in faded shades. That woman had stood where Clara now sat, had laughed in this very room, had poured water from that same kettle. Clara felt like a shadow, an intruder in a place already claimed. Samuel finally lowered himself into the chair across from her, his face lit by the fire's glow. He did not look at her right away. Instead, his eyes rested on the flames, his jaw tight, as though the heat of the fire had carried him back to some night too sharp to forget. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost unwilling, yet clear. Her name was Anna, he said. She was small, quick to laugh, stubborn enough to ride against any storm. Clara held her breath, her eyes on him, the truth sinking heavy into her chest. He had not needed to tell her. She had known the moment she saw the picture. But hearing his voice wrap around the name gave it weight. She died 2 years past, he continued. Sickness that came with the winter. The fever swept through like a brush fire. And when it left, it took her with it. He had buried her at the ridge where the cottonwoods grow, the ground soft enough for digging even when the snow still lay heavy. Clara lowered her eyes, feeling the depth of his loss pressing against the walls. It was not bitterness that filled his voice, but grief worn down by time into something quieter, a sorrow that had never truly left. The silence that followed was not like the silence in the wagon, nor like the silence at the table earlier. It was fuller, layered with memory and hurt. Clara folded her hands tighter, uncertain if she had any right to sit here, if her presence was not a trespass on sacred ground. The townsfolk had whispered of his coldness, of his stern ways, but she could see now it was not hardness that held him apart, but grief. She understood it, in her own way. She too had lived with the ache of being unseen, of being told she was not enough, though her loss was not the same as his. Samuel's eyes lifted at last and met hers, steady, unreadable, but not cruel. For the first time she felt that perhaps he saw her, not as a replacement, not as someone to fill a shadow, but as another soul who carried ghosts of her own. The fire crackled between them, warm and restless, and though neither spoke again, something had shifted in the quiet. The house still held its ghosts, but for that moment they shared the hearth, and neither was alone in the silence. The morning came clear and cool, the kind of spring morning when the sky seemed wider than it should, and the air carried the scent of thawing earth. Samuel hitched the wagon early, his movements calm and practiced, and Clara stepped out of the house with her shawl drawn close around her shoulders. She had not been asked to come, yet she sensed it was expected, and though her stomach twisted at the thought of facing people again, she climbed onto the seat beside him without a word. The horses pulled them down the winding trail toward town, hooves drumming softly against the dirt road, the only sound between them for a long while. When they reached Dry Creek, the square was already busy. Wagons lined the edges, stalls crowded with sacks of flour, bolts of fabric, and iron tools. Men bartered in loud voices, women carried baskets, children darted underfoot. Clara felt every eye on her as Samuel guided the team through the bustle. She kept her gaze lowered, but the whispers rose anyway, brushing against her ears like nettles. Some spoke low enough to think she would not hear. Others made no effort to hide their words. "Couldn't find better," one man said with a laugh. "Plain as a fence post," another muttered. A woman near the fabric store leaned close to her neighbor, her voice sharp as a knife, saying, "Samuel must have been desperate to bring home a girl like that." Clara's cheeks burned, though the air was cool. She kept her hands tight in her lap, her jaw clenched against the sting. She had lived with judgment all her life, but here the weight of it felt heavier, because it touched not only her, but the man beside her. She feared he might regret what he had done in the square, feared the mockery would wear him thin. Samuel pulled the wagon to a stop near the general store. He stepped down, then turned to her, his eyes steady beneath the brim of his hat. "Come along," he said, his voice even, as if the whispers had not touched him at all. Clara followed, her steps slow, her head bowed. Inside, the murmur of voices seemed to trail after them, thick as smoke. They gathered flour, salt, and lamp oil. Clara lingered near the shelves, wishing she could disappear among them, when a voice rose behind her, louder than most. "She ain't much to look at," a man said. Surprised haze settled for that. The words cut sharper than the rest, but before Clara could shrink further, Samuel turned. His voice was low, but it carried through the store with the weight of iron. "I don't need beauty," he said, "only truth." The room went still, the words hanging heavy in the air. The man who had spoken looked down, his face flushing, and the whispers faded into silence. Clara's chest tightened, not with shame but with something warmer, something unfamiliar. For the first time since she had stood on the auction block, she felt defended. She walked out of the store beside Samuel, her steps a little steadier, her heart holding fast to the sound of his voice. The sky darkened with heavy clouds, though the day was still young, the kind of sky that warned of change. Clara worked in the small garden behind the house, turning soil with her hands, planting the seeds she had bought in town. She tried to lose herself in the simple rhythm of digging and patting the earth, but her mind would not settle. The whispers from Dry Creek still clung to her, words that bruised though they left no mark. She had thought perhaps the silence of the ranch would ease them, yet they echoed in her chest. When she looked up, Samuel was walking from the barn, his shoulders straight, his steps even. He carried a bucket in one hand, and the weight of some unspoken thought in the set of his jaw. That evening, as they sat at the table, Clara asked about the man who had watched them in town, the one with the fine vest and sharp smile, who had lingered too long at the corner of the store. Samuel's spoon paused above his bowl, and for a moment he did not answer. At last he said the name with quiet disdain. Preston Kane. He owns half the valley, and thinks the other half is his by right. Clara remembered the man's eyes, cool and cruel, fixed not only on Samuel but on her, as though she were something beneath his boot. She shivered, the stew in front of her forgotten. In the days that followed, she noticed Preston's presence more. His riders passed the ranch road with deliberate slowness, their laughter carrying on the wind. Men in town spoke his name with both respect and caution, and women lowered their voices when he walked by. He had money, land, and power enough to bend most men, and he carried it like a weapon. Clara learned that Samuel had refused him before, turned down offers to sell his land, to join his schemes, to marry into his family. It made sense now, the tension that hummed in the air whenever Preston's shadow crossed their path. One afternoon, Clara went with Samuel into town again. As they loaded the wagon with supplies, Preston approached, his boots polished, his hat tipped low with a grin that did not reach his eyes. He greeted Samuel with false warmth, then turned his gaze on Clara. "You could have done better, Hayes," he said softly enough that only they could hear. "A plain little thing for a man with land worth owning." Clara froze, her face flushing hot, shame burning in her throat. But Samuel did not flinch. His voice came calm and sharp. "She is mine," he said, "and that is worth more than all your acres." Preston's smile thinned, and he tipped his hat before walking away, but Clara could feel the storm he left behind. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters, she lay awake listening to the silence of the house, wondering if she had brought trouble down upon them simply by existing. She thought of Samuel's steady voice in the store, of the way he had faced Preston without fear, and she clung to it as the storm gathered on the horizon, knowing it would break soon enough. The days grew longer as spring gave way to early summer, the air warmer, the sky brighter. Yet Clara still carried the weight of whispers in her chest. She rose each morning before the sun and busied herself with chores, unwilling to sit idle. She fetched water from the creek, her skirts damp from the grass, and stacked firewood until her arms ached. Samuel never asked her to do these things, but she could not bear the thought of being useless, of being the plain girl others had said would fade into the background. If she was to stay, she wanted to be worth her place. One morning she found a foal tangled in the mud near the far fence. Its legs flailed, eyes wide with fear, the mother pacing anxiously nearby. Clara did not think, she only waded in, her boots sinking deep, her skirts dragging heavy behind her. She wrapped her arms around the trembling creature and pulled with all her strength. Mud clung to her hands and face, the foal kicking wildly, but she whispered soft words, steady and sure, until the little horse stilled. With one final heave, she dragged it free, both of them collapsing onto solid ground. When she looked up, Samuel was standing near the fence line, his hat low, his eyes fixed on her. He said nothing, only nodded once, but that small gesture warmed her more than the sun overhead. Later that week, Clara planted rows of onions and turnips in the garden she had turned with her hands. She bent low in the soil, her hair coming loose from its pins, sweat beading on her brow. She remembered her mother's words, that strength came not from what people saw, but from what a person could endure. As she worked, she felt that truth in her bones. Samuel passed by carrying a sack of feed, and though he did not stop, his gaze lingered a moment longer than usual. At supper that night, he spoke quietly, his eyes on his bowl. "The foal is standing again," he said. "Stronger than I thought it would be." Clara lowered her gaze, her cheeks warming. "It was nothing," she answered. But Samuel shook his head, his voice steady. "It was not nothing. You saved it." The words stayed with her through the evening, echoing in her mind long after the lamps had been blown out. For years she had been told she was plain, a shadow, a burden. Yet here, in this quiet house, Samuel had seen her do something that mattered, and he had named it plain as day. She lay awake in the dark, the sound of the wind moving through the valley, and for the first time since leaving her family, she wondered if perhaps she could belong somewhere. Not because of beauty or charm, but because of what she could give. That thought, fragile as it was, felt like a glimpse of worth, a spark she did not want to let go. The evening came cool, the kind that made the valley feel larger than it was, the sky stretching out like a wide blanket of fading color. Samuel had lit the lamp, and the fire crackled in the hearth, filling the little house with a golden glow. Clara sat at the table, her sewing resting in her lap, though she had pricked her finger twice and could not seem to keep her thoughts straight. Samuel was across from her, sharpening a small blade, with slow, steady strokes, the sound carrying through the silence like a rhythm meant to fill the room. Clara studied the lines of his face in the firelight, the way the shadows deepened the shape of his jaw, the quiet strength in the set of his shoulders. She thought of the whispers in town, the cruel remarks about her plain looks, the way Preston Kane had mocked her with his smile. The words still stung, even as Samuel had stood between her and the worst of them. She wanted to understand why he had chosen her that day on the platform, why he had given her a place at his table when others would have walked away. At last she set her sewing aside and folded her hands, her voice soft but firm. "Why did you take me?" she asked. "You could have had anyone else, someone prettier, someone people would not laugh at." Samuel's hand stilled on the knife, the blade catching the firelight. For a long moment he did not answer, as though he weighed every word like grain in a scale. Then he set the knife down and looked at her fully, his gaze steady. "Because I saw honesty in your eyes," he said. "Because you did not pretend." The words struck deeper than any insult had ever cut her. She blinked against the heat in her eyes, not from the fire but from the sudden ache of wanting to believe him. "I am not clever," she said quietly. "I am not beautiful. Most days I feel like nothing at all." Samuel leaned forward slightly, his voice even. "You are not nothing. You are more than they see, more than they say." He paused, his face softening. "And you are more than I expected." The silence that followed was thick, but it was not heavy. It wrapped around them like a blanket, the fire warming the space between their words. Clara lowered her gaze, her hands twisting in her lap, her heart beating too fast. She wanted to say more, to tell him how the sound of his voice in the store had kept her steady, how the sight of him nodding at her by the fence had given her strength she had not known she had. But the words caught in her throat, too tender to release. Samuel leaned back at last, his eyes never leaving hers. "I do not need beauty," he said, "only truth." Clara held his gaze, her breath unsteady, and for the first time she felt the silence between them shift into something warm, something alive, a promise unspoken but real. The summer heat lay heavy on the valley, the air dry enough to crack the earth and turn the grass brittle underfoot. Clara carried water from the creek in a wooden bucket, her skirts brushing against the tall weeds, her shoulders aching with the weight. She moved steadily, her step sure, though her mind was restless. She had felt the change in town the last time she and Samuel went for supplies. The whispers had sharpened, the looks lingered longer, and the laughter carried a cruel edge. She knew whose shadow stretched behind it all. Preston Kane's smile had followed her even after he turned away. A smile that promised trouble, not only for her, but for Samuel as well. That evening, Samuel returned from a meeting at the stockyard, his face darker than the sky before a storm. He set his hat on the table and leaned his hands against the wood, the silence around him louder than words. Clara watched him from across the room, her sewing paused in her lap. She asked quietly what had happened. Samuel did not look up. "Preston," he said, his voice flat, "he has been telling anyone who will listen that you bewitched me, that you are a curse set on this land." Clara's breath caught, her chest tightening. "A curse," she repeated softly, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. The days that followed confirmed his warning. When Clara walked through town, conversations halted. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men shook their heads as though she carried some invisible mark. Women muttered behind their hands, their eyes sharp with judgment. She felt the weight of their scorn with every step, yet she held her chin high, though her heart ached with each word. In the store one afternoon, two women stood near the fabric bolts, their voices loud enough for her to hear. "Poor Samuel," one said, "tied to that plain, cursed thing." The other laughed, adding that it was only a matter of time before his land withered under her shadow. Clara bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood, forcing herself not to answer. When she returned to the wagon, Samuel was waiting. He saw the strain in her face, though she tried to hide it. "They will tire of it," he said, but his eyes told a different story. Clara shook her head. "No," she whispered. "This is only the beginning. Preston will not stop until he takes everything from you." That night the wind rose, carrying dust across the yard, rattling the shutters like warning knocks. Clara stood at the window, staring out into the dark hills, her jaw tight, her hands folded across her chest. She felt the storm gathering, not in the sky but in the hearts of those around them. She had thought she was learning her worth, that she had begun to carve a place in this life, but now Preston's lies threatened to take it all. Samuel stood behind her, his voice low but firm. "Let him come," he said. "I will not bend." Clara did not answer, but she pressed her hand against the glass, watching the night, and prayed silently that strength alone would be enough. The night had been still, the kind of stillness that carries a warning if a person listens close enough. Clara woke first, the sharp scent of smoke reaching her before the sound. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding, and through the small window she saw the faint orange glow rising against the dark ridge. She shook Samuel awake, and he was on his feet at once, pulling on his boots, his face grim. "They are setting the fields," he said, his voice low but certain. Clara knew without asking who he meant. Preston had stopped hiding behind whispers. Now his malice had taken fire. They ran from the house, the cool night air thickening with smoke, as the flames licked higher on the horizon. Samuel grabbed the buckets by the door and shouted for her to wake the neighbors, his tone sharp but steady. Clara did not hesitate. She rang the iron bell that hung on the porch, its clang splitting the night. The sound echoed through the valley, a call that every rancher knew, the signal for death or disaster. Within minutes the glow of lanterns bobbed through the dark, voices rising as men and women came running. When they reached the south field, the sight was near unbearable. The fire had caught the dry grass fast, roaring high, eating through the crop with greedy teeth. The heat slapped at their faces, sparks flying wild in the wind. Samuel's voice cut through the chaos, calling for a brake line. Clara's eyes swept the land and fixed on the old livestock wall, rotting and leaning, 30 feet of heavy timber behind the barn. "If we pull it down," she shouted, "it will block the fire's path." Samuel blinked at her, his face lined with both doubt and trust. "It would take 10 men to move it," he said. Clara's jaw tightened. "Then I will be 10. She ran to the wall, her skirts catching on splinters, her arms wrapping around the first beam. With a cry that tore from deep in her chest, she wrenched it loose, the wood groaning, breaking free. Another beam followed, then another, her muscles straining, sweat streaking her face though the night was cool. Men stared, stunned. But when Samuel joined her, his shoulder pressed beside hers, others rushed forward. Together they heaved, the wall shuddering, then gave way, crashing to the earth with a sound like thunder. The fire struck it moments later, scattering, breaking against the barrier. Buckets of water doused the flames, hands passing them one to another until the last sparks hissed into smoke. When it was over, Clara stood soaked with sweat and ash, her arms streaked black, her breath ragged. Around her the townsfolk stared, not with scorn, not with pity, but with awe. One by one their eyes turned from the ruined field to the woman who had faced the fire and held it back. Samuel stepped to her side, his shirt torn, his face smeared with soot, his voice carrying clear and steady. "She is not a curse," he said. "She is the reason we are still standing." No one laughed, no one argued. Hats came off, heads bowed, and Clara felt the weight of belonging settle over her like the night air after a storm. The harvest festival came with the turn of autumn, the air crisp and carrying the smell of baked apples and wood smoke. Lanterns swayed above the square, their soft glow spilling across rows of pies and pumpkins, while ribbons fluttered from poles tied with stalks of wheat. Clara walked slowly at Samuel's side, the weight of recent weeks heavy in her memory but lighter in her heart. It had been only days since the fire, yet already the town looked at her differently. Children darted past with sticky fingers, calling her name, not in mockery but with bright laughter. Men nodded with respect as they passed. Women reached for her hand, their eyes warm where once they had been cold. For the first time, Clara felt no urge to shrink away. She walked in the open, her plain dress the same as before, but she no longer felt plain. The mayor stood on a wooden platform at the center of the square, his voice carrying above the crowd. He called Clara forward, his words simple but clear. Once some said her strength was strange, he declared, but now we see it as a gift. Clara hesitated, her palms damp, her steps slow, but Samuel touched her back gently and whispered, "You earned this." She climbed the steps, the crowd parting before her, and instead of whispers she heard applause, steady and growing louder until it filled the night. She blinked hard against the sting in her eyes, humbled by the sight of faces turned toward her, not in scorn, but in gratitude. The mayor thanked her for what she had done, for saving land and lives when the fire threatened to consume them all. Then Samuel joined her on the stage, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the lantern light. In his hand he held a silver cuff, polished smooth by years, delicately engraved. He spoke softly, though his words carried to every corner of the square. "My mother wore this," he said. "She gave it to my sister, and when she passed, I kept it, thinking I would never find someone strong enough to wear it. Not strong in arms, but strong in spirit." He turned to Clara and slid the cuff over her wrist, the silver catching the glow of lantern light. His eyes never wavered as he said, "You were never too plain. You were always just right for this life and for me." The crowd erupted, voices lifting in cheers, laughter rolling through the square. Clara's smile broke free, wide and unguarded. Not the careful smile she had learned to hide behind, but a true smile that reached her eyes. Samuel offered his arm, and together they stepped down into the crowd that now closed around them, not as strangers, but as a community. Music struck up, fiddles quick and bright, and Abigail tugged at Clara's hand, sticky with cider, asking her to dance. Clara laughed and said she was no dancer, but Samuel leaned close and whispered, "You pulled down a wall and saved a town. I think you can handle a few steps." Clara laughed again, and this time she did not hesitate. She took Samuel's hand and Abigail's, and under the glow of lanterns she danced, awkward but joyful, alive. For the first time, she felt the ground beneath her feet was her own, that she had not only found safety, but had built something more. She had found a place called home. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to Western Love Legends. Leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every trail we ride together keeps these stories alive. And if you ever wonder whether two left feet can dance, Clara is here to prove they absolutely can.